Certainly, I'd like to comment on what a great thing it's been to have had these access to and be invited to participate in these cotton program field visits and everything over the years. They're at least always been educational for me. I hope they have been for most of the other people attending, but I've always learned things at them, and it's always nice to see something about what's going on in the field. And if you work in cooperative extension, a lot of times I've told people that sometimes I feel like the only fields I get to see are the ugly ones, where there's something bad going on. That they're such good growers, they really know how to do almost everything, but in a few cases they have something that looks particularly bad, and that's the one I get to go look at. So it's always nice, and in this particular set of meetings we're usually going to really good fields. We're going to locations where you feel a little upbeat afterwards, usually with what things are looking like. So again, I really appreciate the opportunity for you to include us in these meetings. And again, you're right, we're going to have to come up with new ways of getting information out. We were kind of hopeful earlier this year that there were going to be some opportunities maybe to reinstate the connections with Mike Fax. And I think there's still at least some discussion along those lines with Owen Taylor of being able to distribute information, in the form of, online newsletter type of updates and those type of things. So we'll still try to pursue that and see if there's some opportunities. If any of you have some other ideas as well, let us know, and we'll try to see what we can do to deal with that. I'll mention a few things about Fusarium in a minute, but I think I don't want to tread on some of the things that Dan's going to talk about, but I did want to mention a few things related to pest management. One thing that's a good thing that's happening, I think, at the moment is I think they've identified a new person as a cooperative extension entomologist who would have the opportunity to work part-time on cotton as essentially sort of a replacement for Larry Godfrey, who passed away about 1.5 years ago. So I think they've identified a person, they've made an offer, I think he's accepted, and so I think sometime in the next number of months, however long it takes to actually get those type of things under, finalized, we should have a new entomologist, which as someone trying to masquerade occasionally as an entomologist, or at least in looking at insects, I'll be very grateful to have a real entomologist in there to assist in the field. We've had quite a few issues in the last year or so with trying to do Section 18s for transform, both for aphids and for add that as a possibility also for ligas.
Sorry to interrupt, but while we're on the topic of UC staff, I believe we have a new farm advisor for agronomy for said county as well, don't we?
Yes, yeah, I was going to mention, hopefully you'll have an opportunity, or maybe you've already met her. Lynn Sosnowski is our new farm advisor in agronomic crops and weed management up in Merced and Madeira.
She'll be at our meeting. We have a meeting a week from today in Firebaugh.
Right, I
She's
saw
the speaker
that.
there.
So yeah, I think she's talking about weed control in alfalfa?
Yes.
Okay, so anyway, Lynn actually also comes with cotton credentials too. She's worked real widely in weed management for many years in multiple states, in Oregon, I think in Ohio, in Georgia, and in California. She worked with Brad Hansen up in Davis for a while, I think in weeds and tomatoes. A lot of experience in that, but she worked with Stanley Culpepper, who's the breeder, the extension weed scientist in Georgia, who was dealing with all of the Roundup Ready issues in cotton on pigweed management and so on. So she's got a lot of experience in weed control, and so we're really glad to have her. And she'll probably be, by most people, she has, I think, a Madeira, Merced County assignment, but she'll probably get her phone number spread around and everything to where county lines, I guess I'm not supposed to say county lines disappear, but I'm sure you'll be able to have opportunities to visit with her about, and she'll be involved in meetings like the one that was mentioned. One thing I did want to mention again is the idea that so far this year, at least in my observations, in most places that I've been looking at cotton fields, including our variety trials, it's been, knock on wood, a good pest management, relatively light year in most locations so far. There were some worm issues early on. There were some mite issues early on in the South Valley that I'm aware of. But I did want to mention that it had been sort of quiet for a long time, at least in the fields that I've been looking at. It still is in some of the fields I've been looking at. But starting about 10 days ago, we started seeing some significant increases in ligus populations. So if you're like me and like the idea of not being in the field twice a week to do sweeps and look at things, you kind of get lulled into complacency, at least I do, and switch to doing work on other things. So I was really surprised last week with the ligus counts in a few fields. One of the ones where we have a variety trial, we were getting 6 and 8 counts with occasional locations that were probably in excess of 10. And so we still could have this wonderful start and really nice retention and everything else, and then still get whacked here. And the timing is not real great for that. Just because you've made all these investments up to this point, you still have at least the threat out there of issues potentially with sticky cotton management. With all this heat and everything, it's always a possibility that we have whitefly issues or even late season mite issues if we have heat and water stress that could develop later in the season. So again, if you can try to keep the ligus at bay and retain things this time of the year, there's some advantages hopefully to the earliness that we have in a lot of these fields this year in terms of retention. So anyway, I probably won't say much else about that other than, like I said, it kind of shocked me that it had been very quiet and we had been sweeping these fields, and then it really just sort of popped up. And there were populations of both nymphs and adults in those fields, so I'm not sure where all of them came from, but there were.
What, we could ask Damien, our field scout, Damien Gellin, and Jenna Mayfield is our almond scout, but Damien, what have you seen in local cotton fields?
Counts have been real low, but like you said, in the last week, they've picked up a little bit. I don't get 10s or nothing like that, just mostly up to like 7s, 7 or 8s.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, I don't know, it'll be nice to have an entomologist who can counter me on this, because I think Dan and I have had discussions and arguments for a number of years that Pima, you're trying for a huge number of fruiting sites in order to get a good yield. And I've seen really substantial losses with 2, 3, and 4 counts this time of year. And so I'm waiting for an entomologist to tell me to back off and stop saying things like that. But again, if you need really high yields in order to be profitable, I think if nothing else, those 2 and 3 and 4 counts are a good wake up that you better check it again in 2 or 3 days and decide whether you're at a treatment level or not. Because again, I think this time of year a lot of this can happen fairly quickly. So that would just be my suggestion going forward. Let's see.
I guess the only thing I would add to that, Bob, is retentions, those early squares,
Right.
if you can really pay attention to those most recent squares,
Right.
It doesn't mean that you're not taking some damage right now, but it
Sure.
means if there is damage right now, it confirms,
Right.
Even lower counts can have those impacts. So
Yeah.
just having those observations paired between how many ligus am I getting and what is my top 5 retention, for
Right.
instance.
Yeah, and one of the comments I had from somebody last week, and it gets sort of a little bit more complicated by the week, is like Dan said, when you get into this time of the year, if you remember, back in the Tom Kirby days when you saw lots and lots and lots of charts about the retention curves, and the fact that once you have early fruit set, you're 3-4 weeks or more into flowering, there's a natural drop in the retention numbers that you're going to see. So it's not unusual, this far in for a lot of the fields to be down in probably the 50% chance or so of actually holding those. And then the more fruit you set, the less likely that the new ones coming on are going to continue to be setting, at least in some of the outer positions. But the other part that I had questions asked about last week was whether or not these temperatures that we're seeing are hot enough to cause heat stress related fruit drop. And I guess my take on it would be, and Dan can certainly comment as well, would be that the temperatures so far, as nasty as they are for people and everything, they're not high enough to cause direct damage to pollen. And so, and even the nighttime temperatures, even if they're somewhat uncomfortable and make you want to keep your windows closed at night, they're not generally high enough to cause that level of damage either. So if it lasts for another couple of weeks, and say we're backing off on irrigations and you start getting a combination of water stress in the fields combined with high temperatures up 105, 106, 107 range, then just because of the amount of respiration going on in those plants, you may start to see some fruit losses you could try to blame on heat. But again, in general, at least from our experience and from research done elsewhere, these haven't been high enough. I don't know if you got any comments.
No,
Dan.
I agree. I think we're, especially if things haven't had any water on them, they're gonna vanish 5 degrees heat with low humidity.
Yeah. And one other thing that, Dan may be talking about this that I thought I'd mention about management practices this time of the year is this is usually also the time of year where people are trying to make some decisions on how much they've front end loaded, even if they're drip irrigated, how much nitrogen they put on by about this point, and whether they should continue it for a few weeks more. And again, I think kind of along the lines of what Dan was saying earlier, it really depends on how things are holding in terms of fruit retention. There are some kind of moderate-sized plants that I've seen that are maybe a little bit taller than this table that have just a tremendous fruit load on them. And those plants, if anything, are the early cutout candidates and the ones that are potentially a candidate for some nitrogen stress. And so before you get too far into August, if you have a tendency to think about putting on some supplemental nitrogen like a water run or something else in the drip, I think most of those probably should go on in about the next 3 weeks or so. And I think later than that, I don't know what you think, Dan, but later than that to me was probably more of a wasted effort. Okay. I don't know, any general comments or disagreements or other comments, especially related to pest management?
Well, I got a question.
Sure.
A lot of these plants look like they're close to cut out. A good shed might clean that off a little bit and maybe get the plant going again, or
Yeah.
it's a little early.
Yeah, no, I think I don't know, I've seen people do it both ways. We used to work with some growers down in the Buttonwillow area, and they would essentially be heading toward a fairly early cutout. I mean, they were probably at 5 or 6 nodes above yellow flower, or even sometimes 3 or 4. And the plants would definitely be heading toward a cutout. And in some of those cases, what they did is you could fire the plants back up again, by, they allowed that to happen to a certain degree, but then when it started being really obvious that, say, 2/3 of the field was going into that condition, well then they went in and they put additional water and gave it a really light shot of nitrogen as a water run. And it basically sort of fired up the second cycle. And I don't know, I've got real mixed emotions about the whole idea of sort of the 2-cycle production. You look at the way people have historically done water management in Pima in a lot of locations is the bloom it to the top approach, where you allow a significant amount of water stress and the plant really slows down significantly, then you hit it with water, things start up again, and sometimes that's 2 cycles, 3 cycles like that. And I guess my take on it is a lot of times if the only way you're going to get to the yield levels that you're aiming for is to plan on a top crop, on a later developing top crop. You've got the water for it, and you're, say, in a location where historically you're not nailed by whiteflies in the late season that create a sticky cotton concern. Then there's not a lot of downside to that type of approach. I think, to me, one of the biggest disadvantages to the 2-cycle kind of approach, as opposed to trying to set and hold fruit for one fruiting cycle is, you know, if you can make that happen, is just, again, extending the season. You know, more water use with maybe one additional water. If you're on furrow irrigation in the late season or drip irrigation, you know, having to extend the irrigation season another 2 or 3 weeks to mature those out. Because it still takes, you know, like an August 20th bowl, I think the calculations that we've done and then that we redid a few years ago, you need about, you need the number of heat units you need translates into about 60, 65 to 70 days after the last bloom of that you're going to try to mature out. So an August 20th one isn't really going to be reliably open until sometime in late October. Again, I think what a lot of growers do in the old days when they had a lot of acres of cotton is they would sort of plan their operation so they would have some early maturing fields, some mid, and some late, and adjust your, you know, chances kind of to have a mix of things that you thought you could handle. So again, my thought usually with water management, maybe I don't want to take this away from, you know, from Dan. He may have a better mix of comments on it, but when I had a lot of people I was working with that were using a pressure bomb, where I kind of disagree with the bloom it to the top, use water stress approach on Pima is when people would carry it out to continuously to like 22 to 24, 25 bars. Because to me, what I think is not good is when you go out to the field and at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning, you can see a lot of wilt. So you can see leaves that are really not doing anything photosynthetically by, say, mid to late morning, then you've already eliminated about half of the production capacity of that plant for half of the day. And that's usually not going to be productive. And so water stress in the afternoon at 3 o'clock, I mean, if it feels lousy for you, it's pretty bad for the, you know, I've never agreed with the people who say that, well, you know, more heat is better. Cotton is real happy. It's 112 outside. I don't believe it. It's 95 to 100 degrees would be really nice if we could keep it in the 90 to 100 range. That would be really good most of the time for cotton, even 85, but not 112.
So for this time of year, where would your ideal top bloom be right now? 3, 4 notes from the top, 5 notes from the top?
You know, again, it depends on what kind of yield potential you're going for. I would
Obviously
say
max.
that a lot of the fields that I've seen that I think have really good yield potential right now in Pima are probably, you know, for a 3.5 bale yield potential or something like that. A lot of the bloom it to the top ones are anywhere from 3 to 5.
Okay.
And the ones that are going for 4, 4.5, 5 bale yields, I think most of those people are probably, they have plants that are probably at 6 or 7
Okay.
nodes above yellow flower at this point. So again, part of it is where you think your yield is going to come from, you know, and what the approach is. So a lot of the guys in the 5 Points area that I've seen, that would be nice. A lot of the guys I've seen in the 5 Points area are absolutely the opposite of last year. They have really good early fruit retention in a lot of locations.
On the roadside.
Yeah.
So this was
plant.
actually in the middle of a field, and there weren't any skips. So this I just picked up this morning over kind of not too far from Kerman.
Wow.
And so our first position yellow flower is right here. Okay, you see that first up? And so if we count the nodes above that, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere just after 6. So this is a field that, what's the date today? July 24th. So we've got a couple of, we've got 3 weeks to make a Pima crop, right? So so I would imagine he's going to still continue to push this a little bit, and this is not the time where you want to cut back on a lot of water, but you can tell it hasn't been a super vigorous growth season for him. This is actually a drip irrigated field, So you kind of see, steady, regular node intervals without a lot of long internodes in between, suggesting that there was, extremely vigorous growth. So they've done a good job of managing this field, and look at all of the positions on it. So, and last year, this same field, it got planted late. He had just started working with drip irrigation. The drip didn't get on in time. It was a disaster. In fact, I think I brought a few of those plants last year at this event. So talk about night and day. I'm glad they decided to plant cotton this year, because I mean, look at this as a first fruiting branch. It's got 2, 4, 6, 7 bowls down on just the bottom branch. Then all of them are going to make it. Right. So and then look at fruiting branch number 3 here. Nothing on 2, but look at fruiting branch number 3. 1, 2. That's a flower. That's a weird. That's a. Yeah. Pima can be really strange. Anyways, there's like 5 bowls on this second branch.
Well, and this is usually
here we go.
A real good indicator that you've got nice growing conditions and really low pest pressure, because all the axillary position, the ones that pop at the same node, this plant's so happy it's setting all those.
And look how many blooms are going off at the same time. So we've got first, second, we got main stem. We got all these. We got 4 positions popping right now. Here's one from yesterday, another one from yesterday. So this is definitely looking like it's got a way to go. And we still have a number of squares up on top. And we've got a few weeks to go, so.
And it's not running out of steam. I mean, it's super, like Dan said, these nice short internodes on the top. It's really, that growth is very nicely under control.
And we don't know the variety, do we?
No, we don't. Not on this one. I can call and find out, but a very big, this is a huge contrast to an Pik-A-Lok type in terms of what we're seeing going forward now, in terms of what's possible, in terms of making a yield.
Well, and that's one of the things that I see if Dan agrees with me or not. But one of the things when we've done a lot of plant mapping over the years, one of the things that we were used to thinking, particularly when we were aiming more in the 3.5 bale yield numbers for Pik-A-Lok varieties, is got used to the idea that most of your fruiting potential on the plant was covered in anywhere from maybe 9 to 13 nodes, fruiting nodes on the plant. And that translated a lot of times into most of the action from the first bloom to the last one that you were likely to set, might be as short as 35 to 40, 45 days max. Well, in Pima, in these fields that keep on going and all, even if they don't have a lot of losses you're trying to make up with, like 2-cycle production, some of them have active blooming for probably as much as 2 months. And so the idea that you're really managing things pretty tightly in a 30-day period or so, I think is sort of out the window with Pimas when you're aiming for really high yields. It's sort of active management is, you can add another 3 weeks to that probably at a minimum for high yield potential situations. So again, I'm glad you brought that, Dan, because I've seen some fields like this and all, and I sort of wishful thinking, it would be lovely to have this continue for another couple of weeks here and all, because it would really pay some benefits for everybody after last couple of difficult years. Okay, the other one, I gave you a handout. I can see if there are any questions. I always wonder whether people have heard enough about Fusarium race 4, and I should go away and not talk about it anymore. But you can grow tomatoes in bowls or whatever if you want me to take a hint and stop talking about it. But the handout pretty much was put together in combination with Phytogen, and it addresses a lot of the things about containment issues, and mentions again the fact that it potentially is seed-borne, that it's a long-lived spore or types of spores that can be present in soil for a long period of time and can be moved around by moving soil by various methods, tillage practices, irrigation, tailwater reuse, and so on. So I think the handout covers most of that pretty well. So I thought maybe what I'd do is give you a little bit of an update on what we've been seeing in the field this year in terms of some specific situations and sort of continuing spread. So most of the calls that I've had this year to come up and look at fields or evaluate fields have been in parts of Kern County where we actually hadn't seen expansion for whatever combination of reasons in recent years, and then basically up in this area and points north. And so I think with Pima expansion happening relatively late up in the North Valley, I think that's part of the reason why we haven't seen as much FOV up in this area until really the last probably about 4 or 5 years. And then again, quite a few widespread locations now where it's been identified. So it's here, and particularly if you end up still wanting to grow specific, highly susceptible varieties, you'll experience it if you're growing cotton in those fields. So one of the things I did want to mention that is a little bit different in terms of an observation this year is that the good news for now is that with the Pima varieties, both from Phytogen and from Monsanto Delta Pine, you have multiple choices of varieties that have been through their breeding and testing program. We've looked at them, but they've certainly looked at them extensively. And so you have ones like Phytogen 841 and 888 and 881 that sort of replace some of their earlier versions like 802 and Phytogen 800 and Phytogen 805. And then from Delta Pine, Monsanto, you have DP 341, DP 348, DP 358, that all are good options in terms of relatively high, among the highest levels of fusarium resistance of anything that we've tested, and I would presume, most of what they've tested at the company level. What's a little bit different this year, though, is that I think some of these fields have kind of risen to inoculum levels that we're seeing in a few cases, probably about 10 different fields. We've seen about 5 to 15% stand losses, even with those varieties. And so part of the reason to kind of pay attention to what happens in these fields is we'd like to kind of have an idea of whether that is an expanding problem. We used to observe this same type of thing with Phytogen 805, and our interpretation with Phytogen 805 was that basically it's a really quite good variety in terms of FOV4 resistance, but you can actually get inoculum levels high enough that it starts to pick off some of the plants. And so if you see those type of things, it still would be good to call the seed company. It'd be good to call University of California folks like me if you're willing. So we can kind of get an idea of whether it's an expanding problem or whether it's still a relatively isolated thing.
Were those fields back-to-back cotton or 2 or 3 years into cotton?
Yeah, if everybody heard the question, it was whether those fields that we're seeing this in were back-to-back cotton. Of the 10 or so that I'm aware of, about half of those were second or third year cotton. But some of the worst ones that I've seen up in the North Valley actually followed melons or tomatoes. And so they had cotton either 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But again, this organism, like we've talked about before, it's a saprophyte, so it actually survives real nicely as long as there's roots of almost any other species, including weeds. And so it persists pretty well in the field, and kind of the more intense the agriculture is, so if somebody's doing like double cropping, where most of the year you have something growing in the field, that is conducive to the organism kind of hanging in there and surviving to a certain degree. And so we still don't know of a rotation that really seriously knocks down the survival. The one that works the best is summer fallow, which I think it's been opportunistic to realize that mostly when you have a drought and nobody's got any water and they can't make any money, well then it's summer fallow. And we followed some of those fields, and that actually knocks down the survival, and you get less problems in years following a summer fallow.
I have it in fields, and if we plant wheat, then take it out and then rip it and let it dry out, and you can go 2 years, then it starts showing up again, and we end up having to go back into wheat. We
Yeah.
kind of keep it in check, I think.
Yeah, and I do think the wheat, one of the things that, that I keep having to remind myself and then remind other people as well is that, we've had holes in cotton fields forever. So, I mean, we still have Phalaeviopsis, we still have alkali spots, we still have vert. And in some of these locations where we're growing, relatively newly introduced varieties that were selected for yield, fiber quality, and Fusarium race 4 resistance, a lot of times they weren't selected specifically for verticillium wilt resistance. So, I mean, that's one thing we've been trying to kind of keep our eyes open about whether or not we see vert expanding. To me, I'd be interested in anybody's comments. Vert is sort of always there, and I think it's in all the ground that we've ever planted cotton in the San Joaquin Valley, more or less, but I haven't seen a big explosion of problems with vert, with the change in varieties that we're now planting. And so, every once in a while I'll run into something that seems to be just ultra vert sensitive, particularly in some of the uplands that are, originate in other parts of the country. But so far so good, I think, in the Pimas. I haven't seen a lot of problems, and pretty good cross section of uplands. At least I think the vert problems usually are only moderate. So anyway, to me, one of the other things I'll mention is that it sort of changes the climate and adds some other resources to it, is that Fusarium race 4 has been found last year. It was identified and confirmed in West Texas in the El Paso area. And so they're taking it very seriously within millions of acres of cotton that they have in Texas. So right now it's in their Pima production area in the El Paso area. It's quite far removed from the rest of the state's upland cotton production. And they're taking it real seriously, and it's been sort of like our experience here. They have a collection of susceptible varieties that they had still been growing in the West Texas, El Paso area, and that's where they saw the worst damage, and that's how it got their attention. So, to me, that's bad news, but the other part is that both USDA and the Texas A&M system, the Texas Department of Agriculture, definitely have this on their radar now. And so there's a whole collection of resources in Texas that I think are being brought to bear on looking at, kind of expanding the research efforts. And so to me, I think that's a plus. I mean, I still personally feel like what would be a great combination for growers in California and probably elsewhere would be identify the most resistant cultivars. So we're still working on, California industry supported, USDA supported breeding program, both for Pimas and uplands. But I think with the concerns for Texas now, you're going to have even more of an emphasis on expanding those efforts and involving more breeders. And I think the other part that I'm hoping, I'll mention a couple names. There's a couple of researchers in College Station, Texas, that are interested in kind of having a greatly expanded program looking at crop rotation impacts on survival of FOB inoculum. And then also both in Texas, and then Maggie Ellis at CSU Fresno, who's a pathologist there at Fresno State, have programs where they're trying to look at possibility of in-furrow materials. I think everybody's a little more skeptical about seed-applied materials, but in-furrow materials that might provide a reduction in the infection rate when you're dealing with FOV. And in a lot of ways, to me, until you can get a darn near perfectly resistant variety, which I'm not sure when they're gonna find that, or if it exists in something that you can turn into a commercial cultivar in the near future. Until you have that, well then, to me, a lot of ways, the solution is a really resistant cultivar, the best that you can identify, combined with any kind of a chemical treatment that is affordable, that will even just knock down the pathogen or reduce the infection rate. I don't think it has to be perfect to be useful, and to me, I'll use an example that many years ago, I don't know how many years ago it's been, we were doing some work on quadrus as part of sort of a statewide effort and everything, and my recollection from some of the stuff I was looking up on quadrus is that the treatments and some UC studies paid for themselves in about 2/3, paid for themselves or did much better in about 2/3 of the treatment locations. And if that was the payback percentage, 65–70%, and it cost $150 an acre, then the answer probably is still no. But with that payback and the right price, if it's, I don't know, what's a good number now for quadrus applications per acre? 30? 35, 40, something like that. For that kind of a payback on a reasonable price, I think there are some options. And so I'm hopeful that may be some of the things that will be coming in the future. So most of the emphasis on the work that's UC has been involved in, myself, some of the advisors, and Mauricio Ulloa from USDA in Texas, our emphasis has been on identifying resistant cultivars. And again, I think you have really good options in Pima. Even with some of these issues that I mentioned, I think in general these are good materials that are likely to behave quite well and still have some good high yield potential. And I do think, put in the request again, if you see problems in your fields and you know it's FOV and we've been there before, if you see some things that look still either sort of strange or they're not what you were expecting when you grow some of the better performing varieties, let us know, because we'd like to kind of chronicle those and hopefully learn something. There's a couple of fields that we planted some screens in some fields up in the Dos Palos area, probably, I don't know, maybe even the first week of June. So we went into some areas where they had some problems. We were seeing more than what we expected in the way of losses, and we went in and planted some additional screens essentially midsummer. Hopefully we'll learn something about that and identify ones that may be even better. I don't know, Dan, do you have any other comments or anything on the fusarium?
I have a question.
Sure.
Timeline for race 4. First discovered here, California?
Okay, the question is a timeline for race 4 fusarium. It was identified in India and China decades ago. And the tools for race identification are much better now than what they were, 25, 30 years ago. So they think that those are the same basic strains of this organism. It was identified first that I know of in California in 2001 in Fresno County, or right on the border. Fresno and Kings can share the credit or blame, whatever you want. But within about 3 years, then we had identified probably about 4 different regions that seem fairly distinct in the San Joaquin Valley and multiple counties. So I think the introduction was sometime in the 90s, most likely. It's a spore population dependent organism, and the chances of you actually either seeing that you have something infected or noticing anything in the field are kind of related to the population of spores in the field. And so it takes a while, especially if you're doing crop rotations. It can be a couple of years before you detect anything, or it could be 10 years. And the argument I would always make, in the area down in the Huron, and I'm always amazed, since I used to be based out of Shafter, In Shafter, you know, if I stopped my car every time I saw a field that looked like this, I'd be slamming on my brakes continuously because of the variable soils down in that area. But in the Huron area, you know, those areas stuck out like a sore thumb because the fields were usually just flat as a pancake across, you know, and so if there was a hole or a stunted location, it really stuck out. And so I wouldn't say that's where everything originated, but it certainly was one of the locations where it was first observed.
But nothing in Arizona at this time?
They have, there was an effort about, probably about 5 years ago to do a more aggressive kind of survey type of approach to look for FOB in states all across the United States. And they found some very interesting, weird things at that time, including some strains that they'd never seen before that they think are worse than race 4, especially on uplands. But they did not find any race 4 at that time. And Arizona, I think they received about, I don't know, 70 or 80 samples to evaluate in Arizona because they were concerned about that because of its status as a seed producing state. But haven't found it yet. And I don't have a good explanation for, what I would,
The El Paso?
Debbie Downer that I am, I guess, you know. I feel like I'm the Grim Reaper when I come up to a field and somebody asks me if it has race 4 fusarium in it. But anyway, I would be inclined to say that it's likely there in Arizona and just hasn't shown up yet. And to some extent, California and Arizona are difficult because we sort of, you know, it's not great for the industry, but we sort of buried some of these fields for observation purposes by the acre reductions. So, you know, we've got a quarter of the acres we had 30 years ago. Arizona's had some really rough years as well. So I do think the organism is likely there just because seed transmission is one of the potential avenues. So, and again, you know, in order to be proactive about all of these type of things, I mean, I think more research resources from the company perspective, as well as public institutions, is a good thing, just because the more you learn about race 4, you know, I keep reminding people that the reason why we started looking at race 4, you know, specific identification of race 4 was that it didn't look like race 1 that was root knot nematode dependent. It was on the wrong soil types and everything to be race 1. And we were concerned at the time, 20 years ago, about the Australian FOBs. And as far as I know, you know, again, knock on wood, I don't think the Australian FOBs have been identified here in the United States. But that's what we were originally looking for. And so, you know, the other part of it is that I think there's still a lot that isn't known about what either climatic factors or soils related factors are going to determine the spread, the rate of spread of some of these type of materials. I think it has been, a difficult lesson to see how rapidly Fusarium as a species has moved through lettuce in California and Arizona, how rapidly race 3 Fusarium has become an issue in tomatoes, across a lot of counties, and then the same experience that we've had in cotton. And so it's a difficult one to contain, and that's, I guess it's self-serving for me to say so, but I mean, I still think that the efforts really of the seed companies and, public breeders to some extent to look for resistant varieties is one of the better places to put the efforts. And I think it's going to be just a continuing battle. And the other part to me that's a real up kind of thing is that the molecular tools that are available now from, I can't claim to be an expert, but the molecular tools from the people I talk with offer some opportunities for a whole lot faster development of methods to go after new diseases as they appear. So if you say, man, we got race 4 licked, in 5 years or something, and then someone says, oh yeah, by the way, now you have the Australian one as well, it's not reset button, start over again. You have a lot of information available, and the molecular tools should allow them to do, I think a faster cycle on trying to answer the questions and come up with something that'll work on that. And, so I think that's a real plus with the greater access to tools and information that's available now. So, okay.
Thank you, Bob.
I said I wasn't going to talk much about fusarium, and I ended up doing it anyway.